Welcome to Inspirational True Stories. Before we dive into today's story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If this is your first time here or you haven't subscribed yet, please support us by hitting the subscribe button. It truly means a lot to us. Thank you so much. Now let's jump into the story we have for you today. The morning air hung thick with the muted hum of life stirring in Copper Hill. Darius Durant, a young postman of 26, began his day by tugging on his navy blue cap and adjusting his mail satchel, the weight of the envelopes and packages familiar and comforting against his side. His footsteps were purposeful, carrying him through the quiet streets as if each house, each mailbox was an old friend. To Darius, being a postman was more than delivering letters. It was about connecting with the neighborhood, being a part of people's lives in a quiet, understated way. He felt the heartbeat of Copper Hill in each nod, smile, and small wave that greeted him as he passed. Today, as he set out along his route, there was something different in the air, a faint sense of unease that clung to him like morning dew. His route had become second nature, he could almost walk it blindfolded, but today, his mind drifted. There was a weariness in his steps as he thought of Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived alone in a modest, weathered house just a few blocks away. She was always so punctual, stepping out to greet him each morning like clockwork, her gentle, wrinkled face lighting up with a quiet smile as she took her letters. But lately, Mrs. Thompson hadn't been waiting by her door. Instead, the yard was slowly gathering an untamed look, with weeds and overgrown grass creeping up around the walkway. The mailbox brimmed with uncollected newspapers and letters, all gathering dust. Darius felt a pang of concern. Copper Hill was a small community, where people noticed when something was amiss. And this, he thought, as he approached her house, was distinctly amiss. Observing the signs, Darius felt an uneasiness settle in his stomach. The yard, usually kept with a sense of understated pride, was now choked with weeds, the flowers in the front bed withered and forgotten. Newspapers lay scattered near the steps, turning yellow and curling at the edges under the sun. The sight was unsettling, like a picture out of focus, and he found himself instinctively smoothing the front of his uniform, an unconscious gesture to ward off the worry that was beginning to coil within him. With a tentative knock on the door, Darius waited, half expecting Mrs. Thompson to appear, her frail frame and gentle voice assuring him that everything was fine. But silence greeted him. He knocked again, this time louder, his hand resting against the wood a moment longer, as if he could somehow feel her presence through the barrier. The door remained firmly shut, the house quiet as a tomb. Reluctantly, Darius scribbled a quick note, letting her know he had passed by and would return tomorrow. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. As Darius walked away from Mrs. Thompson's house, a strange sense of heaviness followed him. The quiet of Copper Hill, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, pressing down on his thoughts as he moved to his next stop. The image of her neglected yard, the papers piled in disarray, and the mailbox filled with days-old letters stayed fresh in his mind. These details might seem insignificant to someone else, but Darius understood that small signs often hinted at larger stories. Throughout his route, his mind wandered back to Mrs. Thompson. Every sight, the carefully pruned bushes of one house, the freshly mowed lawn of another, only highlighted the stark difference in her unkempt home. He found himself asking questions he couldn't answer. Why hadn't she come to the door? Was she unwell? Or perhaps too weak to make it outside? It felt strange, even invasive, to speculate about her private life, but Darius couldn't ignore the worry tightening in his chest. After finishing his last delivery for the morning, he decided to circle back. Mrs. Thompson's house waited quietly, as if it were holding its breath. Darius walked up the path once more, glancing around, hoping maybe he'd see a light on inside or hear the faint shuffle of footsteps. But the silence was deafening. The house seemed to stand in protest, rejecting any signs of life or movement. He hesitated, reaching out for the doorbell, his finger lingering just a moment before pressing it. The chime rang out, echoing within the stillness. Darius waited, straining to hear something, anything that might indicate Mrs. Thompson was okay. But again, only silence answered. Taking a step back, he scanned the house's facade. The curtains were drawn, blocking any glimpse into the interior. The small decorative birdbath in the front yard was dry and gathering leaves. He noticed how the once bright paint on the door was peeling, flaking away in patches that exposed the wood underneath. These details accumulated in his mind, each one a piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of neglect and isolation. Reluctantly, Darius walked to the neighboring house, hoping for some insight. Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who'd lived in Copper Hill for decades, was out on his porch, rocking back and forth with his usual steady rhythm. As Darius approached, he took off his cap in a respectful nod. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," he said, trying to keep his tone light, though concern sharpened his words. "I noticed Mrs. Thompson hasn't been around much lately. Have you happened to see her?" Mr. Jenkins sighed, setting down his coffee mug with a slow shake of his head. "No, son. Haven't seen her in weeks now. Used to be she'd come over every other day, just for a bit of a chat. But lately, nothing." He looked out toward her house, his brows drawn together in a frown. "It's strange, though. She was always one to keep things neat, like that yard of hers. Now, look at it. It's like the place has given up, same as she has." Hearing this only deepened Darius's concern. The idea of Mrs. Thompson, a proud and independent woman, living in such isolation troubled him. The state of her home was speaking, even if she wasn't. With Mr. Jenkins's words echoing in his mind, Darius decided he couldn't just walk away. This wasn't like Mrs. Thompson. She was as reliable as the sunrise, always there with a gentle wave and a warm smile, rain or shine. Now, standing in front of her house once more, he felt a prickling unease that made him shift uncomfortably. Something was off, and every instinct urged him to find out why. He approached her door again, feeling the quiet weight of the house bearing down on him. Taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly, listening as the sound echoed through the stillness. This time he added a gentle "Mrs. Thompson." His voice sounded too loud, too invasive against the silence, but he couldn't let his worry go unchecked. When there was no response, he pressed the doorbell once more, the chime ringing out faintly inside. As the seconds ticked by with no answer, Darius glanced down at the pile of letters he'd already collected for her that day. Bills, advertisements, a brightly colored envelope that looked like a birthday card, each piece of mail a silent reminder of the life she seemed to be withdrawing from. He set the stack carefully on her doorstep and took a small piece of notepaper from his satchel. With a pen, he scrawled a short message: "Stopped by today to check on you. Please let me know if everything's okay. Darius." Placing the note on top of the stack, he felt a pang of guilt, as if he were intruding on something private. But the neglected state of her home, coupled with her absence, weighed heavily on him. He lingered for a moment longer, almost willing her to appear, to step out and brush off his concerns with a laugh, perhaps apologizing for keeping him waiting. But the only response was the stillness pressing down on him, as if the house itself were holding its breath. As he turned to leave, he glanced back over his shoulder, the empty windows staring back at him like blank eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Mrs. Thompson's life had always seemed steady, predictable, and orderly. Now, every small detail, the untidy yard, the unopened mail, the absence of her warm, familiar presence seemed to speak of a quiet unraveling. Reluctantly, he walked away, trying to brush off the sense of foreboding clinging to him. He told himself that maybe she was simply away, staying with family, or perhaps resting. But he knew her too well to believe that entirely. Mrs. Thompson would have let someone know. Perhaps Mr. Jenkins, or even Darius himself. She wouldn't have just disappeared without a word. Continuing down his route, he tried to shake off the weight of his thoughts, but the worry gnawed at him like a dull ache. He'd dealt with plenty of people who came and went from Copper Hill, but this felt different. This was Mrs. Thompson, a woman who'd lived in the same house for over 30 years, who prided herself on knowing her neighbors, who never missed a day collecting her mail. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Copper Hill, Darius couldn't shake the gnawing worry about Miss Thompson. Though he continued his route, each step felt heavier, each delivery somehow less significant compared to the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. By the time he reached the edge of his path, he decided he needed more information, something to confirm or ease his concerns. And there was only one person he could think of who might know more: Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Thompson's longtime neighbor and friend. Mr. Jenkins's porch was as familiar as any place in the neighborhood. The old man was always there in the mornings, sipping coffee, his gaze taking in the neighborhood with quiet affection. As Darius approached, he noticed Mr. Jenkins in his usual spot, rocking back and forth in a well-worn chair, eyes half closed against the sun. But today there was an unusual stillness to him, a sense that he too had noticed something amiss.
Darius climbed the steps and tipped his cap, catching Mr. Jenkins's attention. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," he greeted, trying to keep his tone casual. "I was just over by Mrs. Thompson's place, and, well, it looks a bit neglected. Haven't seen her around much lately. You noticed anything unusual?"
Mr. Jenkins sighed deeply, the lines on his weathered face deepening as he set his coffee mug aside. "Mornin', Darius," he replied, nodding slowly. "Ain't seen her in a while now. Not since '02, maybe 3 weeks back. Used to be she'd come over and chat most mornings, share a bit of gossip, why no? But lately she's been keeping to herself. He shook his head, his voice heavy with concern. Strange, too. Never known her to let her yard get like that. Darius felt his concern deepen. Mrs. Thompson was a creature of habit, known for her meticulous upkeep of her home and garden. If she hadn't even made her usual visits to Mr. Jenkins, it only underscored how unusual her absence was. And did she mention anything about feeling unwell? Maybe she's just been sick and hasn't felt up to coming outside? Mr. Jenkins scratched his chin thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing as he searched his memory. Now that you mention it, she did say something about feeling a bit tired last time we talked. I thought maybe it was just the summer heat getting to her, but she didn't seem herself. Kind of frail, like she was worn down from something. She's never been one to complain, you know that. But she wasn't looking too good. A flicker of worry crossed Mr. Jenkins's eyes as he looked over at Mrs. Thompson's house, his gaze lingering on the overgrown yard and the faded paint on the front door. She was always so proud of that house, wouldn't let a weed grow without pulling it herself. To see it now, his voice trailed off, as if the state of her yard somehow mirrored something deeper within her. Darius shifted his weight, sensing the shared concern between them. I left her a note, hoping she'll get back to me. I'm just worried, I guess. She's got no family around here, right? Mr. Jenkins shook his head, his expression somber. No, her husband passed years back, and her son's off somewhere in California, last I heard. She never talks much about him, so I reckon they aren't that close. She's always been a tough one, why no? Independent. But even the strongest of us need a hand now and then. Darius nodded, grateful for Mr. Jenkins's insight but also feeling the weight of their shared worry. The thought of Mrs. Thompson facing whatever struggles lay behind that closed door alone unsettled him. I'll check back on her tomorrow. Maybe she just needs a little help, but doesn't want to ask for it. Mr. Jenkins gave a nod of approval, his face softening slightly. You're a good man, Darius. Copper Hill could use more folks like you, always looking out for others. If she doesn't come around soon, well, maybe we have to do more than just check in.
With a final nod, Darius continued on his way, the conversation deepening his resolve to make sure Mrs. Thompson was safe. The sense of responsibility settled over him. A quiet determination to help however he could. Because in Copper Hill, people looked out for one another.
By the time Darius finished his route and returned to the post office, his mind was still wrapped in thoughts of Mrs. Thompson. He tried to focus on his duties, sorting out the last of the letters, preparing for the afternoon tasks, but his mind kept circling back to her empty yard, her quiet home. Even the routine hum of the post office, a comforting backdrop on any other day, couldn't break through his worry. Finally, as the clock struck noon, Darius took off his cap, hung up his satchel, and decided to step out for lunch. The small diner down the street, Mabel's Place, was his usual spot. As he walked through the door, the familiar clink of silverware and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee washed over him. Mabel, the owner and a woman with a warm smile and sharp eyes, waved him over from behind the counter. Darius. The usual, she asked, already reaching for a mug to pour his coffee. Yes, Mom, he replied, managing a smile as he took a seat at the counter. But Mabel, perceptive as ever, caught the shadow in his eyes. Something on your mind, hon? She asked, setting the coffee in front of him and leaning in, her tone shifting from friendly banter to genuine concern. You look a little more serious than usual. Darius. Mabel's face softened, a touch of worry flashing in her eyes. Poor Miss Thompson, she murmured, shaking her head. She's lived here longer than most of us, but these past few years I could tell she was slowing down. She used to come in here, sit by that window, and chat my ear off about her garden or whatever book she was reading. Mabel sighed, brushing a stray hair back. Haven't seen her in here for a while now. Darius nodded, comforted by Mabel's familiar presence but also feeling the weight of her words. I thought maybe she'd gone to visit family or something, but Mr. Jenkins mentioned her son's out in California, and they aren't exactly close. It just doesn't sit right with me. Mabel placed a hand on her hip, her gaze drifting toward the window as if she could see Mrs. Thompson's house from there. You're a good one, Darius, looking out for her like this? Not everyone would bother to notice, let alone worry. Folks tend to keep to themselves these days. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. But I'll tell you this, if you feel something's off, trust that instinct. Copper Hill's always been a close-knit community. We can't just ignore one of our own. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Darius's lunch, a simple sandwich and fries. He thanked Mabel and took a bite, though his appetite had dwindled. He felt a sense of duty, a quiet calling to do something more than leave a note or a stack of mail. Mabel gave him a sympathetic look. Maybe go back and check again later? Sometimes people are too proud to ask for help, even when they need it.
Darius nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Mabel. I'll swing by after work, just to make sure. Maybe she'll finally answer the door. As he finished his meal, the thought of Mrs. Thompson alone, possibly struggling in silence, weighed on him.
As Darius wrapped up his afternoon duties, the unsettled feeling gnawing at him had only grown stronger. Mrs. Thompson's house loomed in his mind, with its overgrown yard and silent windows. Every instinct told him he couldn't just ignore it. So at the end of his shift, he walked back to her street, his steps purposeful but tinged with a quiet worry. When he arrived, the house looked just as he had left it that morning, silent and still, as though it had been abandoned by time. The overgrown weeds and scattered newspapers seemed almost like sentries guarding the secrets within. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and knocked firmly on the door. This time he added her name in a voice loud enough to carry through the quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson? It's Darius from the post office? For a moment, only silence answered. But just as he was about to knock again, he heard a faint shuffling from behind the door. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. When the door finally opened, what he saw took him aback. Mrs. Thompson stood before him, but she was hardly the woman he remembered. Her hair, usually neatly combed and pinned, was tangled and limp. Her skin looked pallid, almost gray, and deep lines etched her face as if carved by worry and fatigue. The light in her eyes, once bright with warmth and humor, had dimmed. And worse yet, her clothes were stained, her shirt crumpled as though she'd been wearing it for days. A faint, unpleasant smell lingered in the air, mixing with the stale, musty odor wafting from inside the house.
Darius, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though it pained her to speak. Her eyes flickered with a faint recognition before dropping to the floor, avoiding his concerned gaze. I didn't hear you before. I've just been a bit tired.
Her words were thin, brittle, lacking the warmth he was accustomed to. Darius forced a gentle smile, hiding the worried gnawing at him. I just wanted to check in. Mr. Jenkins and I hadn't seen you around and, well, I was a bit concerned. Mrs. Thompson offered a shaky smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, dear. Just been a little under the weather. No need to worry yourself. But as she spoke, Darius couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the interior. The house was dimly lit, with curtains drawn tightly across the windows. Papers and old mail lay scattered across a nearby table, and a half-empty glass of water sat neglected on a dusty shelf. The once cozy living room, filled with warm memories of books and plants, was now a shadow of itself, cluttered, forgotten, and neglected. Are you sure, Mrs. Thompson? He asked softly, trying to keep his tone gentle but steady. Maybe I could bring you something, or perhaps help tidy up a bit. For a moment she looked torn, her hand gripping the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. But then she shook her head, her face clouding with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. No, Darius, I'm perfectly fine. I don't need any help. Darius swallowed, his concern deepening. He knew better than to push her, but the sight of her, frail and standing in the doorway of a house that mirrored her struggles, left him feeling helpless. All right, he replied gently. But if you need anything at all, please let me know. I'll be around, and so will Mr. Jenkins. She nodded, a hint of gratitude softening her hardened expression. But as she closed the door, the weight of his worry only grew. He could see that she needed help, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Darius lingered on Mrs. Thompson's doorstep, the door firmly shut, yet the image of her worn face and frail posture lingered in his mind. Something inside him urged him not to walk away, to do more than simply offer his words of concern. He was already halfway down the steps when he turned back, almost on instinct, and gently knocked again. To his surprise, the door opened slightly and Mrs. Thompson's weary eyes met his with a look that held both hesitation and a silent plea for help. Without a word, she stepped back, allowing him a tentative glimpse inside, and then she motioned for him to enter. He nodded, his heart tightening with worry, and stepped into the dim hallway. As his eyes adjusted to the low light, Darius took in the details around him, each one more troubling than the last. Dust clung thickly to the furniture, and piles of papers and unopened letters lay scattered across every surface. A faint, sour smell hung in the air, blending with the musty odor of stale air and mildew. Darius remembered this home as a cozy, welcoming place where Mrs. Thompson's laughter once filled the rooms. Now it felt more like a place forgotten by time, a shadow of its former self. In the living room, The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the sunlight, leaving the room in a perpetual dusk. Darius noticed stacks of dishes and cups gathering dust on the side table, remnants of meals long past, untouched and left to sit. Books, once carefully arranged on shelves, lay open and forgotten on the floor. Each item was a small testament to the life Mrs. Thompson used to lead, now dulled by neglect. Mrs. Thompson shuffled behind him, her thin frame moving slowly, her steps labored. "I know it's a bit of a mess," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I just haven't had the energy to keep up with it all." Darius turned to her, compassion softening his gaze. "You don't have to do this alone, Mrs. Thompson. We're all here to help if you'll let us." But she shook her head, her eyes cast downward as if ashamed. "I don't want to be a bother," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. "I thought I could manage, just didn't realize how hard it would get." As she spoke, Darius noticed her hand trembling, her fingers thin and frail as they clutched the back of an old armchair. The reality of her struggle was laid bare before him. She wasn't just tired, she was overwhelmed, worn down by a life of solitude and the weight of her own pride. The house, her appearance, the unopened mail, it all told the story of someone who had been quietly suffering, hoping no one would notice. A pang of helplessness washed over him, but he steadied himself, knowing that right now, what she needed most was kindness, not pity. He glanced around, trying to find a place to start, a small way to ease her burden. "How about I help clear this table?" he offered, motioning to the cluttered surface covered in dishes and newspapers. "It'll just take a few minutes." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, glancing at him with a look that was equal parts gratitude and resistance. But after a long pause, she gave a faint nod, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Darius took it as a sign, gently gathering the dishes, each clink of porcelain a soft reminder of the life she'd been quietly holding on to. As he worked, Darius felt her watching him, a small glimmer of relief softening her features. The room seemed to breathe a little easier with each item he cleared, as if shedding the weight of neglect one dish at a time. In that moment, he felt an unspoken bond forming, a quiet promise to be there for her, to bring a bit of light back into her life. As Darius continued clearing the dishes from Mrs. Thompson's cluttered table, a deeper worry took root in his mind. Glancing over at her, he noticed her labored breathing, the slight shake in her hands, the way her eyes struggled to stay focused, as if even the simple act of standing took all her strength. The reality of her frailty weighed heavily on him, and he knew that what he was doing, tidying a table, clearing away dust, wasn't enough. Mrs. Thompson needed more help than he could give. He gently placed the last dish on the kitchen counter and turned to her, his expression serious. "Mrs. Thompson," he began softly, "I think you need more than just a little help around the house." She looked up at him, her face pale and worn, but her pride held her back. "Darius, I've managed on my own for a long time. I don't want to trouble anyone," she murmured, her voice strained yet defiant. But as she spoke, she swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Darius's heart clenched. He didn't want to disrespect her independence, but watching her struggle to stay upright, he realized he couldn't, in good conscience, leave her like this. Her condition was beyond what a friendly visit could resolve. She needed immediate, professional help. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, trying to keep his tone calm and reassuring, "I think it might be best if we called someone, just to make sure you're all right. You're not looking well, and I think it would be safer." She shook her head weakly, a hint of fear in her eyes. I don't want to go to the hospital. They don't understand. I can't afford all that." Darius took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's just a precaution," he said, trying to ease her worries. "We just want to make sure you're okay. I'd feel better, and I think Mr. Jenkins would, too, knowing someone checked on you." For a long moment she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the worn kitchen floor, as though weighing her last bit of strength against the growing fear that something was truly wrong. Finally, she nodded, a quiet resignation in her expression. Taking her consent as permission, Darius gently guided her to a chair, ensuring she was comfortable before he stepped outside. Once he was out of earshot, he dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in calm, careful detail. His words were steady, but his heart raced, aware of the gravity of the call. He described her symptoms, her frail appearance, and the general neglect of her home, painting a picture that underscored the urgency without overstating it. "Please send someone quickly," he added, his voice carrying the weight of his concern. "She's been struggling on her own for a while, and I don't think she can wait any longer." After hanging up, Darius returned to Mrs. Thompson's side, his demeanor calm but reassuring. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering a small, comforting smile. "Help's on the way, Mrs. Thompson. They'll make sure you're all right, and I'll stay with you until they arrive." Her eyes met his, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability shining through. She reached out a trembling hand, grasping his fingers in a silent thank you, her strength finally fading as she allowed herself to lean on him. In that quiet moment, Darius realized he had done the right thing. The decision to call for help wasn't just about keeping her safe, it was about honoring her dignity and making sure she didn't have to carry the weight of her struggles alone. And as the sound of distant sirens began to approach, he felt a sense of relief, knowing that she would finally receive the care she so desperately needed. The faint sound of sirens grew louder, filling the quiet street as Darius sat beside Mrs. Thompson, offering silent reassurance with his presence. Her fingers still held his, frail but clinging with a quiet desperation. The moment felt suspended, heavy with a mixture of relief and worry, each passing second marked by the distant wail of the approaching ambulance. Soon, 2 police officers arrived, stepping out of their patrol car with a careful, respectful pace. Officer Williams, a familiar face around Copper Hill, gave Darius a small nod of acknowledgement. "Afternoon, Darius. Heard you called this in. Can you give us a quick rundown?" Darius nodded, standing and giving Miss Thompson a gentle pat on the shoulder. "I came by on my usual route," he began, keeping his voice steady, and noticed that Mrs. Thompson's yard and mailbox had been neglected. "When I checked in on her, it was clear she wasn't well. She's been struggling alone, and I don't think she's had the strength to reach out for help." Officer Williams exchanged a quick glance with his partner, then turned his gaze toward Mrs. Thompson, whose tired eyes met his. Her face softened, perhaps comforted by the arrival of people who were there to help rather than judge. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Williams spoke gently, crouching down to her level, "we're here to make sure you're all right. Is it okay if the paramedics come in and check on you?" She nodded faintly, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. "I suppose it would be best," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as though admitting her vulnerability brought both relief and sadness. Moments later, the paramedics entered, bringing with them an air of professionalism and calm. They introduced themselves with a gentle demeanor, careful not to overwhelm her. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, knelt down beside Mrs. Thompson, speaking softly as she took her hand. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I'm Emily, and I'm just going to check a few things to make sure you're okay. Is that all right?" Mrs. Thompson nodded again, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and quiet acceptance. Emily gently took her pulse, her touch practiced and reassuring. The other paramedic began taking notes, glancing around at the state of the home with a subtle but visible concern. Darius watched as they exchanged a glance, both recognizing the severity of Mrs. Thompson's situation. As they continued their examination, Officer Williams stepped aside with Darius, speaking in a low voice. "You did the right thing, Darius. She's clearly in need of help, and sometimes people are too proud or afraid to ask for it. Thank you for noticing." Darius nodded, his gaze drifting back to Mrs. Thompson. "She's been part of this community for so long, I just couldn't ignore it." His voice softened, carrying a hint of the worry he'd been holding back. After a brief assessment, Emily turned to Miss Thompson with a gentle but firm expression. "Mrs. Thompson, I think it would be best if we took you to the hospital. You're dehydrated, and it seems like you haven't been eating properly. They'll be able to take better care of you there, and we can make sure you're comfortable." For a moment, Mrs. Thompson looked apprehensive, her eyes searching Darius's face for reassurance. He nodded, giving her hand a comforting squeeze. "It's just a precaution, Mrs. Thompson. They'll take good care of you, and I'll be here too." With a sigh, she nodded, allowing the paramedics to help her up and guide her carefully toward the stretcher they'd brought in. As they secured her, she reached out, her gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Darius," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the paramedics wheeled her outside, Darius watched, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of relief. He knew she was finally in good hands, and though the road ahead might be difficult, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Officer Williams patted him on the shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of the simple but powerful act of care that had likely saved Mrs. Thompson's life. The sterile, hushed atmosphere of the hospital felt like a world away from the quiet streets of Copper Hill. Darius waited in the reception area, his eyes fixed on the door, through which they'd taken Mrs. Thompson moments earlier. Time seemed to stretch, each minute thick with tension as he imagined her frail frame lying on a hospital bed, finally receiving the care she so clearly needed. He hadn't expected to feel this level of concern, but now, every second that passed felt like a weight pressing on his chest. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse approached him, her expression warm but serious. "Are you here for Mrs. Thompson?" she asked softly, reading the worry in his face. Darius nodded, quickly standing to meet her. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just hoping to hear how she's doing." "She's a neighbor of mine," he explained, the words tumbling out in a rush of worry and relief. The nurse gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner of the waiting area. "Mrs. Thompson is stable, but she's very weak," she said, her tone gentle but tinged with a gravity that made Darius's heart sink. "She's been suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition, likely for quite some time. The symptoms were likely worsened by her cancer." Darius felt a jolt at the word, his mind grappling to process it. Cancer. The word echoed in his head, heavy and unforgiving. He hadn't known Mrs. Thompson was dealing with something so serious. To him, she'd always been the strong, independent woman who waved at him from her porch, her eyes bright and filled with life. The nurse continued, filling in the silence left by his shock. "She's been undergoing treatments, but it seems she's struggled to keep up with them. From what we gathered, she may have been trying to manage her condition on her own due to financial difficulties. Cancer treatment is expensive, and sometimes patients try to take care of themselves at home if they can't afford regular visits." The thought was almost unbearable. Darius couldn't imagine the pain and loneliness she must have endured, trying to fight a battle as consuming as cancer all by herself. Her pride, her fierce independence, and perhaps her fear of burdening others had kept her silent while her health slowly declined. "She'll need to stay here for a while," the nurse said, her voice softening. "The doctors want to get her stabilized and ensure she's properly hydrated and nourished before discussing her treatment options. But well, she'll need support. We've seen cases like hers before, where older patients living alone try to manage without help. It's not easy, and it takes a toll." Darius swallowed, his throat tight with a mix of anger and sadness. He couldn't understand how Mrs. Thompson had slipped through the cracks, her struggle unseen until now. He took a steadying breath, nodding as he absorbed the nurse's words. "I'll make sure she gets that support. She's part of our community, and we take care of our own." The nurse gave him an encouraging smile. "It's good to hear that, Mr. Durant. She'll need people around her as she goes through this. It makes a world of difference." Darius watched as she walked away, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do to help. Mrs. Thompson didn't deserve to face this alone, not after all the years she'd spent as a cornerstone of their neighborhood. He couldn't bear the thought of her returning to that empty house, trying to care for herself under such difficult circumstances. Resolved, he took a seat near her room, wanting to be there when she woke up. In his mind, he began planning how he could rally the community, bring neighbors together to help her, ensure that she wouldn't have to worry about finances or food or even the state of her yard. Copper Hill was a community, after all, and they wouldn't let Miss Thompson fight this battle alone. As he sat there, a quiet determination settled within him. He would be there, every step of the way, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because she deserved to feel the warmth and strength of the community she had been a part of for so many years. Darius sat in the hospital hallway, his eyes fixed on the door to Mrs. Thompson's room, feeling the weight of what he had just learned. Mrs. Thompson, a woman so fiercely independent and proud, who had always greeted him with a smile and never once asked for help, was now lying in a hospital bed, her body weakened by malnutrition, dehydration, and the brutal effects of cancer. The reality of her struggle struck him deeply, and he resolved to be there, to fill the gap that her silent suffering had created. After some time, a doctor approached him, glancing down at the chart in his hands before meeting Darius's eyes with a calm but serious expression. "You're here for Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice steady but empathetic. "Yes, sir. I'm her neighbor, and I wanted to check on her," Darius replied, his voice laced with a quiet determination. "I'd like to know what's next for her, what she'll need to get better." The doctor nodded, understanding Darius's concern. "She's stable for now, but her condition is serious. We've started her on IV fluids and nutrition to rehydrate and help her regain some strength. Unfortunately, her cancer treatment hasn't been consistent, likely due to financial constraints." He hesitated, then added, "When patients try to handle treatment at home, they often struggle to keep up with the medications and the side effects on their own. It appears Mrs. Thompson has been doing just that." Hearing it laid out so plainly only deepened Darius's resolve. He couldn't fathom how Mrs. Thompson, with all her quiet strength, had endured this alone. "What can we do to help her from here?" he asked, his voice firm. Well, the doctor began, the first priority is to stabilize her, both physically and emotionally. Cancer treatment is demanding, especially for someone her age, and without regular care it can become overwhelming. He paused, noticing Darius's expression of quiet resolve. If she has community support, that will make a huge difference. If she knows there's a safety net around her, It might give her the strength to keep going. Darius nodded, his mind racing with ideas. He would speak to Mr. Jenkins, Mabel from the diner, and others in Copper Hill who cared about Mrs. Thompson. They could organize meal deliveries, help with bills, keep her home in order, and even arrange transportation for her medical appointments. She had spent years as a cherished part of their community. Now it was time for that community to give back. As he mulled over these plans, he noticed movement inside her room. Mrs. Thompson was awake, her eyes weary but watching him from across the room. With a gentle knock on the doorframe, he entered, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked softly, trying to hide the weight of his worry. She gave him a faint smile, her voice barely a whisper. "A bit like I've been dragged here against my will," she joked weakly, her usual spirit showing despite her frailty. But her eyes held gratitude and unspoken thank you for all he had done. Darius pulled up a chair beside her, his gaze steady and full of resolve. "We're all here for you, Mrs. Thompson. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Copper Hill looks out for its own, and we're not letting you face this by yourself." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her hand resting on his, the simple gesture conveying a lifetime of gratitude. I thought I'd be forgotten, left to manage on my own," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But you didn't forget." Darius felt his own throat tighten, but he managed to smile. "Never, Mrs. Thompson. You're part of our family, and family doesn't leave anyone behind." As he sat with her, watching the flicker of hope return to her eyes, Darius knew that his decision to get involved had been the right one. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a part of the heart of Copper Hill, and now that heart was united in helping her heal, one day at a time. In the days that followed, Darius's commitment to Mrs. Thompson became a steadfast part of his daily routine. Mornings and evenings, before and after his shift, he would visit her in the hospital, keeping her company and updating her on the small happenings around Copper Hill. Each visit seemed to bring a bit of color back to her cheeks, a warmth to her eyes that had been missing before. He could see the difference in her, a softening of the burdens she'd carried alone for so long, and it fueled his resolve to ensure she felt supported. It wasn't long before he reached out to others in the community. Mr. Jenkins was the first to join Darius's efforts, offering to help clean up Mrs. Thompson's yard and watch over her house while she was away. Together, they trimmed back the overgrown bushes, mowed the lawn, and cleared out the clutter that had accumulated on her porch. What once looked neglected now began to resemble the tidy, welcoming home Mrs. Thompson had taken such pride in. At Mabel's place, word spread quickly, and soon a handful of regulars were brainstorming ways to assist. Mabel herself took charge of organizing meal deliveries, arranging a rotating schedule so that Mrs. Thompson would have homemade meals ready once she returned home. "We'll make sure she never goes hungry again," Mabel declared one morning, her determination as fierce as her cooking skills. Each meal came with a note from a neighbor, a small reminder that she wasn't alone. As the community rallied around her, Darius also took on the more challenging task of helping her navigate her medical bills and treatment plans. He sat beside her in the hospital room, a notebook open on his lap as they went through the options. Mrs. Thompson's insurance had left her with limited resources, and it became clear why she tried to manage alone. "I didn't want to be a burden," she confessed one afternoon, her voice tinged with the vulnerability she had kept hidden. "I thought if I could just handle it quietly, no one would have to worry about me." Darius. With a newfound sense of hope, Miss Thompson began opening up to the assistance that Darius and others offered. They worked together to arrange a meeting with a financial advisor, and through the community's support and a few local organizations, they secured a fund to help cover her ongoing treatments. Each step brought her closer to stability, and with each small victory, her spirits lifted a bit more. As the weeks passed, Darius's commitment deepened, extending beyond daily visits and financial assistance. He took it upon himself to be her advocate, attending doctor appointments with her, asking questions, ensuring she fully understood her treatment options. He listened to her worries, offered a steady presence, and became her connection to the world outside the hospital walls. Together, they shared stories of Copper Hill, laughed about the small-town quirks, and made plans for the future. His dedication didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Thompson, who often looked at him with a gratitude she struggled to put into words. "I never thought anyone would care this much," she admitted one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me a reason to keep going, Darius." He reached out, taking her hand gently, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We're in this together, Miss Thompson. I'm not going anywhere." And as he left the hospital that evening, his heart felt lighter, his resolve unshaken. He realized that the commitment he'd made wasn't just to help her recover physically, it was to remind her of the strength and love that surrounded her, to make sure she knew that, in Copper Hill, no one was left to face life's hardest battles alone. With each passing day, Darius knew he was part of something larger than himself, a quiet act of kindness that had grown into a bond unbreakable by time or hardship. As Darius walked home from the hospital one evening, the quiet streets of Copper Hill, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, he found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken with Mrs. Thompson. What began as a nagging worry had become a profound lesson in compassion and resilience, one that left a lasting imprint on his heart. Each step along the way had taught him something new, not only about Mrs. Thompson but also about himself and the power of community. He remembered those first hesitant knocks on her door, the worry in Mr. Jenkins's voice, and the sight of Miss Thompson's once vibrant yard overrun by weeds. The little signs that had called him to action now felt like echoes, guiding him to recognize the quiet suffering so many held within. Darius knew he would never look at his neighbors the same way again. In the small acts of kindness and the shared struggles, he had seen the heart of Copper Hill, a place built on the invisible bonds that connected them all. As he passed by Mrs. Thompson's house, Darius paused, admiring the transformation. The freshly trimmed hedges and the tidy lawn, kept up by Mr. Jenkins and other neighbors, now stood as a quiet testament to their commitment. Her front porch had become a symbol of the strength the community offered, a place once neglected, now cared for with love and respect. Darius thought of Mrs. Thompson's face that evening in the hospital, her eyes shining with hope as she spoke of her plans to plant new flowers in her garden once she returned home. That single spark of anticipation of wanting to live fully and reconnect with the small joys of life was what had driven him to be by her side. She had been given a second chance, not only to heal but to feel truly seen and valued by those around her. And in that, he found his own resolve strengthen, knowing that this commitment didn't end when she was discharged. He decided that his role didn't stop at delivering letters and packages. He would carry forward this spirit of compassion, looking out for the signs of those in need, no matter how quietly they might call for help. It wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson anymore, it was about all of Copper Hill. From the diners at Mabel's place to the elderly couples who walked the park paths, he felt a renewed purpose to serve them, not just as a postman but as a neighbor and friend. As the stars began to dot the sky, Darius made a quiet promise to himself. He would continue to check in on Mrs. Thompson, even after she returned home, and he would find ways to help others in the same silent need. Life in Copper Hill would go on, but it would do so with a deeper awareness of their shared humanity. That night, as he lay in bed, his heart felt lighter yet grounded, filled with the resolve to live up to the trust Mrs. Thompson had placed in him. And with that, he drifted into sleep, his mind at peace with the knowledge that, in their small town, no one would be left to face life's hardest trials alone. Darius knew that his role in Copper Hill had transformed, woven with empathy and resilience, a promise to carry forward the strength they had all found together. As Darius walked home from the hospital one evening, the quiet streets of Copper Hill bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, he found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken with Mrs. Thompson. What began as a nagging worry had become a profound lesson in compassion and resilience, one that left a lasting imprint on his heart. Each step along the way had taught him something new, not only about Mrs. Thompson but also about himself and the power of community. He remembered those first hesitant knocks on her door, the worry in Mr. Jenkins's voice, and the sight of Mrs. Thompson's once vibrant yard overrun by weeds. The little signs that had called him to action now felt like echoes, guiding him to recognize the quiet suffering so many held within. Darius knew he would never look at his neighbors the same way again. In the small acts of kindness and the shared struggles, he had seen the heart of Copper Hill, a place built on the invisible bonds that connected them all. As he passed by Mrs. Thompson's house, Darius paused, admiring the transformation. The freshly trimmed hedges and the tidy lawn, kept up by Mr. Jenkins and other neighbors, now stood as a quiet testament to their commitment. Her front porch had become a symbol of the strength that community offered, a place once neglected, now cared for with love and respect. Darius thought of Mrs. Thompson's face that evening in the hospital, her eyes shining with hope as she spoke of her plans to plant new flowers in her garden once she returned home. That single spark of anticipation of wanting to live fully and reconnect with the small joys of life was what had driven him to be by her side. She had been given a second chance, not only to heal but to feel truly seen and valued by those around her. And in that, he found his own resolve strengthen, knowing that this commitment didn't end when she was discharged. He decided that his role didn't stop at delivering letters and packages. He would carry forward this spirit of compassion, looking out for the signs of those in need, no matter how quietly they might call for help. It wasn't just about Mrs. Thompson anymore, it was about all of Copper Hill. From the diners at Mabel's place to the elderly couples who walked the park paths, he felt a renewed purpose to serve them, not just as a postman but as a neighbor and friend. As the stars began to dot the sky, Darius made a quiet promise to himself. He would continue to check in on Mrs. Thompson, even after she returned home, and he would find ways to help others in the same silent need. Life in Copper Hill would go on, but it would do so with a deeper awareness of their shared humanity. That night, as he lay in bed, his heart felt lighter yet grounded, filled with the resolve to live up to the trust Mrs. Thompson had placed in him. And with that, he drifted into sleep, his mind at peace with the knowledge that, in their small town, no one would be left to face life's hardest trials alone. Darius knew that his role in Copper Hill had transformed, woven with empathy and resilience, a promise to carry forward the strength they had all found together. As Darius walked home from the hospital one evening, the quiet streets of Copper Hill bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, he found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken with Mrs. Thompson. What began as a nagging worry had become a profound lesson in compassion and resilience, one that left a lasting imprint on his heart. Each step along the way had taught him something new, not only about Mrs. Thompson but also about himself and the power of community. He remembered those first hesitant knocks on her door, the worry in Mr. Jenkins's voice, and the sight of Mrs. Thompson's once vibrant yard overrun by weeds. The little signs that had called him to action now felt like echoes